WNYC Studios is supported by Odoo. When you buy business software from lots of vendors, the costs add up and it gets complicated and confusing. Odoo solves this. It's a single company that sells a suite of enterprise apps that handles everything from accounting to inventory to sales. Odoo is all connected on a single platform in a simple and affordable way. You can save money without missing out on the features you need. Check out Odoo at odoo.com. That's odoo.com.
It's the Brian Lehrer Show on WNYC. I'm Bridget Bergen, senior reporter in the WNYC and Gothamist newsroom, filling in for Brian today. It's the end of June, so it's another day where we're expecting the Supreme Court to issue opinions. So we've got our eyes on what's coming out today, and we will bring you the news when we have it. There are cases outstanding on birthright citizenship, transgender athletes, mail-in ballots, and other major issues. Emily Bazelon from Yale Law School is standing by and will be our guest later this morning if today is the day for one of those blockbuster opinions. Plus, WNYC and Gothamist housing reporter David Brand will be back to talk to us about the problem of rent-stabilized apartments sitting empty here in the city, more than 57,000, according to a recent count. The mayor got his rent freeze, but what's up with all these empty apartments? But first, we're kicking things off with some Monday morning politics. The House is supposed to get back to work in Washington, D.C. today. It comes after last week's primary wins for Mayor Mamdani and the DSA-aligned Democratic congressional candidates who are set to remake the Empire State's congressional delegation. They're also likely to bring challenges to House Minority Leader Hakeem Jeffries, who's poised to become the first black Speaker of the House of Representatives should Democrats take majority control in November. But for now, lawmakers are stuck in the same old partisan gridlock, with Republican infighting creating ongoing headaches for House Speaker Mike Johnson. We'll get an update on the fight over a voter ID law backed by President Trump that's standing in the way of an unusually bipartisan measure, plus a preview of the Democrats' playbook for 2029. Nicholas Wu is a congressional reporter at Semafor who covers all these topics and more. He joins me now. Nick, welcome back to WNYC. Thanks for being with us this morning.
Good morning, and thanks so much for having me.
So the House is supposed to be in session through Thursday before that July 4th recess. But let's start where things ended last week. There was a big bipartisan housing bill that was headed for President Trump's desk, but didn't quite make it. And that's because President Trump's singular focus on another piece of legislation. So, Nick, tell us first about that bipartisan housing bill and what it was set to do.
So this was a piece of legislation that had been in the works for months and months and was a very rare bipartisan compromise on Capitol Hill for, an issue that's on the minds of a lot of people, the cost of housing. And so this is the kind of legislation where you have a rare convergence between folks like Elizabeth Warren and conservative Republicans, because among other provisions, this bill would basically place curbs on the buying of single-family houses by institutional investors as one way of trying to tackle the price of housing. But of course, this was something that ran afoul of President Trump when he decided to make a protest over the progress on the SAVE Act, the elections legislation that he's been pushing for months.
Nick, I feel like I have been talking to folks like you and other reporters about this SAVE Act for at least a year, right? Let's talk, for those of you who have not been following as closely as I know you have been, what would the SAVE Act do, and why has this become President Trump's priority?
The SAVE Act has become a fixation of President Trump's. Basically, ever since the start of his presidency, he saw this as a way to right the wrongs of, the 2020 election, which he still believes was stolen from him on the basis of mail-in voting and voter ID. And so what the SAVE Act would do is basically address a lot of those issues. It would, require much stricter voter ID. It would, clamp down on mail-in voting. And this is something that a lot of advocates are saying would be hugely disruptive to an election, not even 5 months away. And for that matter, It just doesn't have the votes in the Senate. There's not 60 votes to clear a filibuster there, and it's not clear there's even majority Republican support for that.
Listeners, we want to hear from you. We're going to be talking a lot in this segment about what the Congress is trying to do this week and ahead of the November elections. But we want to know, what would you like to see on the congressional agenda ahead of the November elections? Besides the housing bill, are there other bipartisan agenda items you'd like to see the House take up? And how do you think last week's primary elections stand to reshape the congressional debate ahead of the midterms? Call in with your Monday morning analysis or any other questions you have for my guest, Semafor congressional reporter Nicholas Wu. The number's 212-433-WNYC. That's 212-433-9692. We can take your calls and texts. House Speaker Mike Johnson was on Fox News this weekend saying he spent time talking with President Trump in the Oval Office, and he is sending the housing bill for him to sign today. Here's what Johnson said yesterday.
We made a lot of promises to the voters, and we're fulfilling those every single day of this Congress. And this is a big part of that because it will increase the availability, the access to more housing, bring down cost, cut regulations, do the things that we know are very important for that market. The president and I talked about that at length. Of course, he wants to do all those things. I'm going to send the bill over to him. It's passed by both chambers. I'm sending it to him on Monday, and it will become law. And I certainly want him to take the biggest, boldest marker that he has and do that big Trump signature proudly on that legislation, because we're delivering for the people, and that's what he wants to do.
Now, unless Trump vetoes this bill, the housing bill is expected to become law by, it sounds like, roughly July 11th. How confident do you think lawmakers are that the president will sign it today? Is there any sense that he's willing to stand down even if there isn't action on the SAVE Act? And what do you think it means for the SAVE Act at this point?
A lot unsaid in that interview from the speaker with how exactly this bill will become law, whether it is right by default. If a law is submitted to the president and they don't act on it within 10 days, it becomes law anyway. Or he could veto it. It's really kind of unclear at this point where the president is on this legislation. The speaker met with him last Thursday, and they were trying to find a path forward on the SAVE Act, and the speaker was laying out his plan. Republican leaders would at least in the House, would much prefer to try to basically kickstart the SAVE Act by including a grant program of sorts in another party line bill that they're hoping to do this year. There's no guarantee that that bill will even materialize by the election. Or for that matter, there's a group of conservative hardliners who are trying to attach it to annual defense legislation. And that would imperil that legislation's chances of passing, because the SAVE Act is, of course, so divisive among Republicans. And so, the housing bill, the speaker is right, will become law one way or another unless the president vetoes it. And, with Trump, Republicans on Capitol Hill are very fond of saying that nothing is final until it's final with him.
Well, before we go on and talk a little bit more about that defense spending bill and some of the other obstacles standing in Speaker Johnson's way, just getting things moving again today in the Congress, I want to announce some breaking news on those SCOTUS decisions. Interesting, Nick, in our election conversation now, the decision that came down first this morning was related to mail-in ballots. That's Watson versus the R-S.C. It was written by Justice Barrett. The court holds that federal election day statutes do not preempt a Mississippi law that allows mail-in ballots to be counted as long as they are postmarked by and received within 5 days of Election Day. That was a 5-4 ruling. And from SCOTUS blog, they write, Justice Barrett writes that the Election Day statutes do not set a deadline for ballot receipt, so they do not prevent Mississippi from counting ballots postmarked after Election Day yet received afterward. Amy Howe, one of the writers there, wrote, this is a bit of a surprise. We'll have more on this decision later in the show with Emily Bazelon. But, Nick, since we are talking about elections, and I know you cover some of these issues as well, any reaction from you from how you have seen the congressional delegations lining up on this particular issue?
It seems that this is a case that we might have to figure out exactly how the court reasoned on it. But if the ruling is such that federal laws don't preempt the state level statute, that could perhaps take the wind out of the sails for some of the push for the SAVE Act, because the move to restrict when mail-in ballots can be counted is a major push by the president because he saw that as a big factor in his 2020 loss.
All right, so more to talk about in terms of the elections and this election ruling later in the show, but let's shift gears back to the obstacles in Speaker Johnson's way. You started to touch on this, Nick, in terms of the House's recess last week and some of the stalemate related to potential amendments being attached to the defense spending bill, also connected to the SAVE Act. Florida Representative Anna Paulina Luna was among those who was pushing, back against any rules that Speaker Johnson was trying to move forward with. The House Rules Committee is set to meet again this afternoon. Do you anticipate there could be another stalemate today?
It's very possible. And it really speaks to the tiny majority that House Republicans have. They have to make this party line vote before any piece of legislation on the rule that sets up debate. And that's, something that, given the margins in the House and then on the Rules Committee, really gives power to any small group of lawmakers to obstruct legislation in protest of something else. And so in this case, you have a very small but determined group of conservatives, Anna Paulina Luna among them, who have really taken the president's message to heart about blocking legislation unless there's action of some kind on the SAVE Act. And the question for Hill Republican leaders is what they can offer to this group of holdouts, to move them off this ledge, if at all possible. After the speaker and President Trump met last week, Trump put out a message on Truth Social saying that they all need to stop their grandstanding. But at this point in the year, and given that this is a somewhat determined group of lawmakers, it's not clear whether that message from Trump alone is going to be will be enough to move their position.
Listeners, if you're just joining us, this is the Brian Lehrer Show on WNYC. I'm Bridget Bergen, senior reporter in the WNYC and Gothamist newsroom, filling in for Brian today. I'm joined by Nicholas Wu, congressional reporter for Semafor, and we're taking your calls and texts about the current congressional agenda, what you'd like to see on that congressional agenda ahead of the midterms, and how last week's primary elections are set to change the debate going into 2028. And let's start with Santiago in Brooklyn. Santiago, you're on WNYC.
Hi, good morning. I'm calling because I'm curious about the status of, I think it's called the Clarity Act. It's a big pro-crypto bill. It kind of would further legalize and normalize crypto in the financial system. It was led by Senator Gillibrand and Senator Tim Scott of South Carolina. I read somewhere that it'd been held up and it was going back and forth. I'm just curious where it's at. And I would add that I think that it would be very interesting to have Senator Gillibrand on WNYC to hear from her constituents about this as her priority. But that's my editorializing it. And I'm actually curious about what's going on.
Santiago, thanks for that question. Nick, have you been following that legislation?
Somewhat. And the issue with the Clarity Act is it seems that a lot of the hurdles to it in the Senate are what exactly it would do about regulating the Trump cryptocurrency and how that would be handled. Since there's a lot of bipartisan consensus around trying to do something about crypto, but there is some question about the regulation of these sorts of provisions closer to the president, and that is the kind of thing that can end up undercutting what could be some more bipartisan deal making.
Let's shift gears a little bit, Nick, and look at some of the challenges facing Democrats and some of the infighting they are facing at this moment. You reported on a call over the weekend among House Democrats over an amendment related to security funding for Israel. Can you tell us a little bit more about the call and that proposed amendment?
So this is giving us a very early preview of how things could go with a Democratic majority in the House. And what we're seeing right now is a potentially brewing fight over an amendment to a spending bill that could come up this week, might not come up this week, depending on all the Republican procedural issues that we discussed earlier, related to cutting funding for Israel. And this is something where that very much divides House Democrats, especially in our current political moment. You have progressives who are supporting this this amendment, and then you have more moderate voices in the party who aren't. And so on Sunday, this was really kind of a listening session for Democratic leaders to talk through this amendment and hear from everyone. And how they handle fights like this, which almost certainly are not going away in the future, is really going to be a test for Democratic leaders heading into next year, and especially after we have seen much more progressive voices winning primaries and almost certainly getting elected to Congress next year, who have taken a harder line on Israel and are trying to move the party to the left on Israel-related issues than we've seen in the past.
So at this point, do you get a sense that, Democratic Party leaders are concerned approaching this issue? Obviously, setting aside some of the issues of the Republican infighting and what will happen moving forward in the House there, how much of a concern is it in light of last week's primary wins here in New York by candidates, as you said, who have taken a much harder line against support for this kind of funding going forward?
It's definitely a point of concern for Democratic leaders because, if Democrats take the House, they'll have to make hard decisions on the kind of legislation that they bring to the House floor and how exactly all of it will be structured. And, handling questions when it comes to spending money and, sending aid to Israel will be something that they'll have to contend with. And it's been a huge pain point for Democrats in the past. I've covered, some very big procedural fights over the years among Democrats over how to handle Israel. And, although there's not nearly going to be the same level of opposition in the caucus to a Speaker Jeffries in the way there was with, Speaker Kevin McCarthy or even Mike Johnson in the beginning, there's still the possibility that more progressive wings of the party could move to extract things from him as the leadership contest eventually heats up.
Listeners, we're taking your calls and texts on what you would like to see on the congressional agenda ahead of the November elections. We've talked about this bipartisan housing bill. Are there other bipartisan items you'd like to see the House take up? Do you think they can actually get any of that done? And how do you think last week's primary elections stand to reshape the congressional debate ahead of the midterms? You can call in with your Monday morning analysis or any questions you have for my guest, Semafor Congressional reporter Nicholas Wu. Again, the number is 212-433-WNYC. That's 212-433-9692. We can take your calls and texts. And I want to share some of the texts that we've been getting, Nick. Several people have written about voting rights. One listener in particular texted, "Do not call it a voter ID law. That's using their language to misrepresent it." Another listener said that women's issues needed to be on the agenda, like getting, And another listener wrote that they'd like to see Congress reinstate funding for USAID and soon. That was from Margaret in Bergen County, New Jersey. So a lot of listeners with some proposals for things that Congress could take up. We'd like to hear from you. You can call or text in, and we'll have more of your calls and texts and more from Semafor Congressional reporter Nick Wu right after a break. Stick around. It's the Brian Lehrer Show on WNYC. I'm Bridget Bergen, filling in for Brian today. We're talking Monday morning politics with Nicholas Wu, congressional reporter for Semafor. Nick, this weekend Mayor Mamdani was on ABC this weekend where he was asked about what the recent primary victories here in the city meant for the Democratic Party. And here's a little bit of what he said.
I think we are seeing a hunger that is not just felt by New Yorkers, but frankly by Americans from coast to coast for a new kind of politics, one that puts working people at the heart of it. And I think for far too long, what we as a party have been able to say to New Yorkers who are struggling is simply to explain why they're struggling, not actually offer them a vision for how to make life better. And these candidates, Brad, Daria Lisa, Claire, they ran campaigns that spoke to working people and that said life in the nation's most expensive city need not be this way any longer. And I can't wait to have them as partners in D.C. in that work.
And of course, Mayor Mamdani there referencing the wins of Brad Lander, Daria Lisa, Avila, Chevalier, and Claire Valdez in their primaries last week. Nick, you reported that these wins are creating headaches for Democratic Party leaders. What responses have you heard from Leader Jeffries to the wins? I saw him issue a statement of congratulations last week.
This is something that Democratic leaders are trying to approach very carefully, since as a matter of practice, they have to stand by all their incumbents. But at the same time, Hakeem Jeffries has to try to keep a big tent in his caucus for next year. And these are folks who are almost certainly going to win their general elections. And so the question for them now is how to handle what is almost certainly going to be a very large barrage of attacks from Republicans trying to, hitch every single Democrat to the most controversial statements or former social media posts or whatnot from these more progressive candidates. And we'll have to see how that plays out. We got to remember that Republicans tried this in previous years with AOC, famously in 2018, and that did not dent Democrats' chances at all.
We have listeners with some different takes on the election results last week. Let's try Tom in Brooklyn. Tom, you're on WNYC.
Hello, Nicholas Wu. Hello, WNYC. I want to ask you to speak to the issue that a lot of people are okay with the progressive economic agenda, which is to say the anti-Trump agenda, the pro-worker agenda, and so forth. And then there is a divisiveness around the Israel-Palestine issue. In other words, you got a lot of people who are going to be stay-at-home voters or people who will go Republican because Democrats are now perceived as the not just pro-Palestine, but condoning Hamas and not just anti-Netanyahu, but anti-Israel party. I know that what I'm saying sounds complicated, but it actually sort of boils down to something binary, absolutely simple. Democrats lose to Republicans because of Israel. My question is, how do you think the leadership will navigate this? It is most unfortunate that the great retail politician of our time, Mayor Mamdani, is also tied at the hip to the most controversial statements his parents and affiliates have made about Palestine, Gaza. By the way,
Tom, I'm going to jump in there, Tom, just for a second, so Nick has a chance to answer. And, as you were just stating before, Nick, this is an issue that the Democratic Party is certainly wrestling with because there are moderates within the party who take a much different position, as both some of the more progressive members of the party and some of the new candidates who voters have elected to run for some of these deep blue seats here in New York. Can you talk a little bit more about some of what you're seeing, certainly among the moderates and the progressives who are already in office as they try to, navigate what is emerging as a real fault line within the Democratic Party?
You're already seeing some very subtle sniping, or well, I guess not so subtle in some cases, sniping between both of those wings. We certainly saw that last week after primary election results, and it will be a recurring dynamic through the end of the Democratic primary season. I mean, take the Colorado elections tomorrow. There's a progressive challenger to a longtime incumbent. Melat Kiros is the challenger. Diana DeGette is the longtime House incumbent. And there's not really that much policy daylight between the two, except on Israel. And this has proven to be a very salient issue in Democratic primary elections, and we'll see whether or not this is something that can propel another insurgent candidate to victory. And to think a little bit about how this might function in a future Congress, too, this will be a big pain point for Democrats when they have to put up annual appropriations bills that could include something like funding Israel, or if there could be any number of different foreign policy crises that pop up that in some way relate to Israel or the Middle East. There's unlike Republicans, which generally have achieved unity on the issue, save for a few more isolationist voices, this is something where there are very real divisions among Democrats and points where a minority of Democrats can exercise leverage.
Some of the reaction from moderate Democrats last week was not just related to the primary victories being symbolic of where different members of their party stand on the issue of Israel. Some of it was also very specific to the affiliation of some of these candidates here in New York to DSA, the Democratic Socialists of America. Last week, Representative Tom Suozzi led a group of members signing the so-called Promise for America. And one of the first planks in that letter says, quote, "We are capitalist, not socialist." Now, Suozzi is in a swing seat here in New York's 3rd Congressional District, which is just a small portion of eastern Queens and most of northern Nassau County. He is expected to have a competitive race. How worried are Congress members like him in districts that are potentially a little bit more purple about being seen as affiliated with a socialist leaning party?
For a lot of Democrats, in many ways, they're scarred by the memory of the 2020 House elections, where you might remember Joe Biden won the presidency, but Democrats actually lost seats in the House, and particularly in places like New York and Florida, where the attacks run by Republicans trying to link Democrats to socialists and to the left wing of their party, particularly on issues of crime and taxes, seem to be very effective. And so, this is why for folks like Suozzi, there's already a bit of preemptive positioning on the issue. He's trying to, he does have a purple district, and so he is trying to put some distance between himself and that wing of the party. And, this speaks to the kind of tension that will certainly be a big factor among Democrats if they win next year, when they do have to come together and figure out how they're actually going to govern as a party if that option does present itself to them.
Sure. And are you hearing House Republicans sort of seizing on these wins, going after some of these, making this connection and trying to make an issue of this socialist connection in a way that might be salient in some of those races?
It's already something that we're seeing ad makers from the campaign wings of the House and Senate Republicans kind of really gearing up to do, especially for candidates who do, primary candidates who do come from the more left wing of the party. For Republicans, they see this as, a perfect opportunity to remind voters of the most extreme positions within the Democratic Party. And so the question is for, folks like Suozzi or other Democrats in purple districts, whether that is something that they try to reject or embrace, or for that matter, how they reject those views without alienating Democrats who they still need to vote for them.
You mentioned one of the upcoming primaries, and you wrote also that congressional Democratic leaders' endorsement power will be tested further in upcoming primaries in Colorado, Minnesota, and Michigan, where candidates from the centrist wing of the party are fighting insurgent progressives. Nick, I have to admit, we've been pretty focused on New York the past week here. So when are those elections taking place? And again, what are you watching there?
Colorado is tomorrow, and that's the dynamic that I mentioned earlier with that insurgent House candidate Milo Quiros and the incumbent Diana DeGette, as well as other elections in the state, which might not be as close, namely the primary for governor. You have Senator Michael Bennet, who's running against a more progressive candidate. And so there's that. And then in Minnesota, we have a very competitive primary between Angie Craig and Peggy Flanagan. And that, I believe, is the first August 11th, rather, and around the same time as Michigan's. And this is where we have candidates from the more centrist wing of the party running against progressives. And Michigan's actually boils down a little more cleanly there because you have a progressive candidate Abdul al-Sayed, who has made Gaza a very large part of his public positioning. A more kind of centrist candidate, Mallory McMorrow, and then another centrist, Haley Stevens, who has the backing of Democratic leadership and has had the backing of AIPAC in the past. And so, the question for Democratic leaders is whether or not they can get their preferred candidates through these primaries because they see them as the most electable candidates in a general election. And in Michigan, which is a must-win for Democrats to have any chance at a Senate majority, there is some unease among Democratic leaders that if they do elect the most progressive candidate there in the primary, he could lose the general.
I want to bring in Larry from Brooklyn Heights, who wants to weigh in some of these wins from last week. Larry, you're in WNYC.
Yeah. Hey, hi. My thought on this, and it's more general than about, although, a DSA endorsed candidate just won the congressional primary in my district, as you know, Brad Lander. I'm struck by the fact that aside from certain social issues, let's say, trans issues were not on the radar, in the post-World War II beginning era. What DSA people and other extremely progressive Democrats are advocating are, as far as I can tell, simply the same principles that are New Deal democracy, that were the principles that built the middle class in this country. And it strikes me as bizarre and kind of scares me that Democratic leadership, and locally here, that's Hakeem Jeffries and Chuck Schumer and Kirsten Gillibrand, are terrified by this and resistant to it. And it strikes me that the DSA people, again, aside from certain social issues, are essentially conservative. They're just advocating a return to democratic principles that were unbelievably successful. As I pointed out to your screener, Dwight D. Eisenhower was on board with all of this. Republican, that was the compromise of the time. That Republicans were on board with these things, with pro-union, regulated prices, regulated housing in New York City, costs and everything. And now we're looking at our leadership of our own party that since Bill Clinton has this nonsense about how the Democratic Party is losing voters because they're moving leftward. It's been moving rightward since Bill Clinton. Let's be serious. And I wonder if your guest has any thoughts on that.
Larry, thank you so much for that call. And, I will add to what Larry said there, Nick. We're going to talk for a moment here in just a moment about your scoop that is on Semafor today about Project 2029, but it serves as a pretty striking contrast to what Larry is describing there, where, folks like from the Mamdani wing of the party are talking about something that might fit under a more New Deal era of politics versus something like Project 2029. First, any response to Larry?
I think Larry's question there would be something that could fill a book. It's really speaking to the realignment of our politics in so many ways. But what strikes me about the wave of insurgent DSA candidates is actually how little the policy, at least on economics, seems to be playing into these races. You don't, Brad Lander, Corey Valdez, they were not really focusing on that in their campaigns against the sitting members because, in fact, or rather, the more establishment candidates in Corey Valdez's case, since for the most part, they weren't running against particularly centrist Democrats. And same in Colorado tomorrow. Diana DeGette, by all accounts, is not, a blue dog Democrat. Instead, it's this very animating force in democratic politics around foreign policy and Israel in particular that does appear to be bringing folks to the polls and really does seem to be boosting democratic turnout and really bringing out these very progressive voters in primaries rather than any one economic divide. And certainly there are big splits in the Democratic Party over economics. Remember how intensive a fight it was in the party over how big or what the scope of the Build Back Better plan and what all of that became was just a few years ago. But right now, doesn't really seem to be at the fore of the Democratic agenda as much. And that is a good segue into the Project 29 conversation.
Yeah. I mean, I definitely think here on the ground in New York, you do hear a lot of talk about certainly Mayor Mamdani's affordability agenda and as you mentioned, something that might be more akin to a deeper realignment of the Democratic Party to something that is more New Deal-esque, where there is more of a focus on workers and unions and policies that are aimed at, easing the burdens on the working class. But as a deep contrast to that, you reported this morning this new proposal for Democrats called Project 2029, which is, obviously a take on Republicans' policy agenda for the second Trump administration called Project 2025. We teased it a little. So, Nick, what is Project 2029?
Project 2029 is basically Democrats' response to Project 2025. You have this group that's trying to put together an agenda on day one for a new Democratic administration. And what they're focusing on for their first major policy proposal is kids' online safety legislation. It's this multi-point plan to do things like narrowing the liability shield that a lot of internet companies used for and in this case around artificial intelligence. They are advocating for a ban on phones in schools. And trying to wean kids off of screens broadly. But what is striking about this issue is that, although they're promising other plans down the line on things like affordability and the border and AI and so on, this is something where a lot of Democrats are already in alignment that they need to do something. It's not as controversial in the party as if you remember 2 years ago, when Project 2025 was released, you saw Republicans sprinting away from it in a lot of cases, and these sorts of proposals are already things that have already picked up a lot of traction on the left.
I want to bring in a caller who has waited very patiently with a proposal for something that the Congress should take up ahead of the midterms that kind of fit into this part of our conversation. And so, Mike from Flatbush, thank you for your patience. You're on WNYC.
Oh, hello. Can you hear me?
Loud and clear.
Thank you. Thanks for taking my call. It's a privilege, and I appreciate the conversation. And I just want to say quickly, the theory, I think the new slate of DSA candidates would say is that, of course, what goes on internationally is also connected to what happens domestically or what's possible domestically, right? WNYC plays Martin Luther King Jr. speeches during, his holiday, and he made that very clear, especially in the Riverside Church speech. Sure. So I don't think that we could section that off so easily. And to that point, I think that AI and weapons, automated weapons and AI and the public-private sort of partnerships that have arisen here especially in the last few years under Trump, really need some scrutiny and more publicity in terms of what Congress is doing to set a tone, because it's no more natural or given that AI is going to be involved in the future of warfare and then in 1945 we would have atomic bombs going off in every subsequent war. I think that we're still writing the book. We still have a chance to really put some bipartisan focus on this. I'm not talking about the prompt was pre-midterm. So what's possible now? I think it's realistic to say, we can have a panel with experts and get some real attention to what bipartisan efforts have already gone on. There was a kind of a milquetoast report that came out during the Biden administration, and then they just sort of seemed to drop it when Trump came in. So,
but Mike, I want to jump in and just say, so you are calling for a more bipartisan focus on AI regulation. Is that correct?
In short, yeah. Thank you so much for taking my call. Thank you.
Thank you so much, and I appreciate your patience. Nick, I had asked our screeners to have Mike hold on so he could make that point, because it definitely seems to be something that fits under this Project 2029 framework. how much are they talking about AI regulation as a potential plank of it? And, are there any lessons to draw from another primary here in New York, the 12th Congressional District, a very, very expensive primary where, the advocates and opponents of AI regulation poured so many millions of dollars into the campaign for and against Assemblymember Alex Boris, and ultimately it seemed to be a wash because the winner was Assemblymember Michael Lasher for, perhaps a variety of other reasons, but it does seem to be something there about voters' appetite or voters' education on this issue and how salient it will be when it comes to turning out people at the polls.
The 12th district race seems to be something that, for sure had a lot of complicating factors because it was, such a big field, with various kind of celebrity, high-profile candidates that kind of diluted in some ways the impact of the AI spending and the degree to which that motivated people in the race. But it's definitely something that will continue to be an issue in congressional primaries throughout the country. Last week I reported on the Utah primaries where there's a member of House Republican leadership who faced a very spirited primary challenge from a candidate who, towards the end, had basically a 30th of the amount of money that he had in the bank. And she had made data centers in Utah a major focus of her campaign. And so there's definitely this brewing sentiment, and it's something that our caller certainly alluded to among voters, that folks do want to see some kind of action from political leaders on AI, on data centers, and regulating all of that. Now it's just a question of what Congress or a future president will do about it. Congress has not really been able to come to any kind of consensus so far on AI regulation. It's really been in fits and starts. And so, it's something that the Project 2029 folks alluded to, tackling in the future. And it's certainly something that Congress will try to act on. And it's just a question of what sort of consensus they might come to.
Sure. I mean, Nick, one of the great parts of the way you report stories in Semafor is you lay out the stakes and the facts and you sort of give us your take at the end of it. I mean, how likely do you see this issue of kids' online safety, which is, a very important issue and doesn't seem to be something that anyone really owns yet? But how likely do you see it becoming a defining issue for the Democrats in a presidential election year? Or, is it just too soon to tell?
It's a little soon to tell whether it'll become the issue for Democrats in an election year. But the point that the backers of this plan made is that, it's something that isn't a super polarized issue yet. And so there's a lot of opportunity for Democrats to pick that up in their lane and really claim it as an election year issue. And education in many ways has been a uniquely animating force for folks in primary elections. It's just they're going to be vying against a lot of different policy proposals, and every candidate will be trying to claim their own lane and stake their own policy lane heading into a presidential election. And so they're certainly going to be part of a very crowded amount of discourse. They're not likely to be the sole arbiter of Democrats' policy agenda heading into 29.
And just Nick, quickly, who are the architects behind this at this point?
They are folks who come from different backgrounds in Washington. One of the folks we talked to for the story was Chad Maisel, who's their executive director. He's a former White House and Cory Booker aide. Then there's other folks that they're talking to for this whole policy agenda who come from all of the different policy areas that they'll be focusing on.
Okay. Nick, I want to thank you so much. My guest has been Nicholas Wu, who covers Congress at Semafor. You got a busy week. Good luck. We'll see if they get anything done.
Thank you so much.